I didn't really know my brother. Chris was nearly 10 years older than I was, and what that really meant was that Chris was an adult while I was still a child. In retrospect, some of Chris's compulsive behaviours, such as hitting the tennis ball on a string for hours and hours, even into darkness, was an early sign of the mental illness that would dog him for the rest of his life. Goodness knows what was going through Chris's head in his late teens and early 20s, but in his mid-50s he wrote, "Voices echoing in my head tell me I'm alive, not dead. Fear of hell on planet Earth is my fate after my birth. My eyes have seen such visions and scenes that nightmares are my waking dreams." I remember Chris threatening Mum with a carving knife one dinner time before Dad came home. We didn't see much of Chris after that. In and out of hospitals, I understand. On special occasions, Chris would arrive by taxi just in time for lunch. Things would get strange over lunch, and then Chris would be back in the taxi. Schizophrenia scares everybody, the sufferer, the parents, family and friends. I know it certainly scared me as a 12-year-old. Family outings and vacations then revolved around Chris's 4 younger siblings. Chris described the 30 years after his graduation from Sydney Uni as one of hospitalisation for depression and paranoid schizophrenia, which was treated with psychiatric medications, forced attentions, injections, solitary confinement and shock treatment. Fortunately, Chris also writes that he has few memories of this time. Perhaps it was the era, but my parents kept a few secrets. Mum and Dad married in 1951. Chris was born in 1948. Mum had a previous marriage just after the end of the Second World War, which seems to have ended in divorce. I assume Dad adopted Chris. Chris went to Asquith Boys High School in Sydney. And while no one ever looks good in their school photographs, the spectacled Chris, the prefect, looks decidedly unhappy. Chris was still 16 when he went to Sydney University to study Latin. Chris's university and lifelong friend Brian tells me that Chris had the annoying habit of cramming for exams only at the last minute, and still came away with credits. Chris finished his honours year in Latin when he was 20. Chris would return to Sydney University aged 55 to undertake studies on creative writing and poetry, culminating in a graduate certificate in arts. Poetry would become Chris's driving force. There's an inscription on the back of these photo booth shots that reads, "It is 12 o'clock midnight in the last few minutes of my 33rd birthday. I am glad I'm alive. I thank God with tears in my eyes for the precious gift of life, and I pray that with all my heart I may soon live with peace of mind and comfort of a loving wife, who may cry with me, laugh with me, and be mine for good." Chris never did marry, but it certainly wasn't for the want of trying. Chris and Kyoko appear to have met in Sydney in 1978, but Kyoko returned to Japan to undertake a nursing qualification. Chris sends photos to "My darling Katie," and she responds with "To my darling." I remember Chris going to Japan in the summer of 1980-81. The writing on the back of this last photo says, "Kyoko Tominaga, engaged but separated for 3 long years." The relationship seems to have ended, or been ended, in 1981, and this probably explains Chris's melancholy in the 1982 photo booth. His relationship with Sarah progressed a little further. We all went to the registry office with Chris and Sarah, but it was called off by Sarah's guardians with what looks like a little help. Sarah and Chris were still friends and in regular contact right to the end. Chris and Liz seem more relaxed with each other. A friend of the two of them says that Liz would only say that they were best friends. I have no problem with that. I married my best friend. Liz and Chris were best friends for 15 years. Cat Stevens sings that the first cut is the deepest, and for Chris it must have brought equal amounts of pleasure and pain. In the early 70s, Mum suddenly took up being a foster carer for newborn babies being put up for adoption. The baby in the pram that I used to zoom around the house as a 14-year-old turns out 45 years later to have been Chris and Doris's son Damien. The secret of Chris's son went with my parents to their graves. Chris and Damien made contact with each other 10 or 20 years ago and kept in regular communication. Chris was a prolific writer of poetry, writing and publishing 30 or so volumes from 2002. In recent years, he started his own poetry page on Facebook. The online bookshop Book Depository lists 5 volumes of his poems and has a description of one title, Cock and Bull, that states a collection of poetry from Chris Rath, whose easy-to-read poetry has clear meaning and strong, logical connections, which paint astonishing pictures of his own thinking. If I put on my marketing hat, I'd change it to read award-winning poet Chris Rath. He was certainly active, entering competitions, getting academics to launch a book, and manning tables at literature fairs. However, my favourite bit doesn't come from one of his books, but from the cover page of an essay he wrote for his Sydney University grad cert. Chris's dry wit and ability to take the mickey out of himself is neatly summed up. Master Chris Rath, one of the greatest Antipodean poets in English, in the company of former Prime Minister John Gordon in Canberra. The Prime Minister looks petrified, as though he's made of brass, but the poet's heart is full of art. He's a leader in his class. The PM deserves a kick up the arse, but surely the poet deserves a certificate in arts. Chris leaves behind family and friends, but also some additional insights into his life. When you talk to Chris, you could never be certain that he did what he described or whether it was part of some other dream. However, his passport documents trips to Japan, Indonesia, Fiji and Hawaii, and he certainly took on risks and opportunities.